Our scripture lesson, Luke 23, 26, and 32 through 46. We read these words. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on the right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of commendation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last.
This Lenten season, we have been looking at Jesus as Luke pictures him for us. And as we have done that, we have seen how Luke emphasizes that Jesus came as good news for everyone. How Jesus noticed people, especially those who often were unnoticed or overlooked, those who were unheard or unseen or cast away. And we've also noticed how Luke gives us some of our most loved stories of Jesus, stories that aren't found in any of the other Gospels. So this morning, as we come to the day of Jesus' crucifixion, and again, we see that Luke gives us 3 words from the cross that are not found in any of the other Gospels. Only in Luke do we hear these 3 words. Words of forgiveness, words of mercy, and words of peace. I was reminded yesterday what an imperfect world we live in as I watched the coverage of the March for Life. And I thought just the fact that we have so many children in our country that feel like they have to march for life shows what an imperfect world we live in. The fact that so many people in our country have been touched by violence shows what an imperfect world we live in. Good Friday always comes to us as a stark reminder that Jesus joined us in this imperfect world, which makes these words that Jesus says even more important for us to hear. The first word that we hear from the cross in Luke's account of Jesus' crucifixion is, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now, the Romans weren't the first people to use crucifixion as a form of execution, but they did perfect the process to make it last as long as possible and ensure that you endured the maximum amount of agony during the process. Some of the research that has been done more recently, especially examining bones that are found in ossuaries from that period of time, is showing us that crucifixion might have looked slightly different than we often depict it. Based on these bones, it seems that when you were crucified, your arms were outstretched on the crossbeam and were staked there, usually through your wrist bones, in order to hold you to that crossbeam. But your feet weren't usually crossed and staked through them in the front of the cross. Your feet were put on the sides of that long pole and were staked through your ankle bones to either side of the cross. And then partway down that beam that went into the ground, there was this piece of wood that jutted out usually. And it was just a little bit lower than where the criminal's seat would kind of hit. And the temptation as you hung there always was, do you allow yourself to sink a little bit to rest against that piece of wood, tearing through the flesh of your arms and decreasing your ability to take a breath? Or do you push up away from that seat, tearing the flesh of your legs in order that you might breathe? And all the while you're going back and forth between these, your back is rubbing raw against the wood of that cross that you're against. Oftentimes we also picture these crosses as way up high in the sky. You know, Jesus was crucified maybe 10 feet above everybody else, but that's not the way it was done. Actually, you hung with your feet about 2 to 3 feet off the ground. So as Jesus hung on that cross, he was very close to the people who were standing there that day, the people who were mocking and jeering and taunting him. Mary, his mother, would have been able to touch his chest for sure, maybe even his face, if the authorities had allowed her to get that close. Those standing near to Jesus could have easily heard what he said from the cross, even if it was said at a whisper. And just to add to the humiliation, people were crucified naked, taking away the last shred of dignity that they could have. And I've always thought about that. You know, we always put this loincloth around Jesus on the cross because, I mean, to see Jesus hanging up there naked would just be obscene. But that's what it was. It was obscene to see someone crucified. And crucifixions took place right outside the city gates, on the main road leading into town, the road that everyone had to pass by as they left or came into town. It was Rome's warning to everyone. See, this is what happens if you dare to go against Roman rule. Death by crucifixion oftentimes took as long as 3 days. 3 days you hung there, naked, in the elements, for everyone to see as you suffered in agony. Jesus died in 6 hours on the cross, we are told, and that is likely because of the amount of blood that he lost before he was crucified. So this is what Jesus was experiencing as he prayed those words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I can't imagine more pain than what he was in when he prayed those words. This is one of the most powerful statements that we have in all of our scriptures. Throughout the gospel, Jesus kept forgiving people their sins. You remember he forgave the prostitute, he forgave the lame man that was brought to him by his friends, he forgave the tax collectors. This was one of the things that made the Jewish authorities so angry with him. Who was he to forgive sin? They called it blasphemy. But here Jesus, once again, forgives sins, and this time he acts as both the high priest, pleading on behalf of his people, as well as the sacrifice that is made on their behalf. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now the interesting thing is that Luke is not crystal clear on who the them is that Jesus is praying for. It certainly is the people who nailed him to that cross, the Jewish leaders who demanded his death, the crowd standing by watching and jeering as he hangs in agony. But Jesus' plea, it has always been understood understood, is not only for them. It is a prayer that echoes down throughout history. Jesus, hanging on the cross, looks out and he sees you and me. And he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not understand. Have you ever wondered if God could forgive you? Have you ever thought that you had done something that was just unforgivable? You have that moment in your past that it is just so hard to get over, and every once in a while you bring it back up and you chew on it some more and you just think, this was unforgivable. But I ask you, if this is Jesus' prayer as he hangs dying, is there anything we could possibly do that Jesus will not forgive? Stakes driven through his hands and his ankles, hanging in agony from a cross, naked and humiliated, mocked, betrayed, and would Jesus really ask forgiveness for all of the people who did that and not forgive us for what we have done? I want you to know this deeply inside, all the way to your bones. On that cross, Jesus prayed for your forgiveness. Jesus prayed for my forgiveness. Therefore, we are forgiven people. Will you please just repeat this after me? Jesus prayed for my forgiveness.
Jesus prayed for my forgiveness.
Therefore, I am forgiven.
Therefore, I am forgiven.
Let's say it again. Jesus prayed for my forgiveness.
Jesus prayed for my forgiveness.
Therefore, I am forgiven.
Therefore, I am forgiven.
Jesus didn't just forgive people throughout his ministry, though he taught a lot about forgiveness, and especially about our need to be forgiving people. He told his disciples when they questioned him that you must forgive someone 70 times 7. That is like forever. He called us to love our enemies and to turn the other cheek, to pray for those who wrong us. And when his disciples asked him, Lord, teach us to pray, he said, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Jesus knows us inside and out. He knows the kind of world that we live in, and he knows that if we are going to live together as humans, then we are going to need to forgive one another. Often. We know this too. We can't be married without knowing how to forgive. We can't work next to other people without knowing how to forgive. We can't even be friends without learning how to forgive one another. Jesus knew that. He knew that we will let people down over and over and over again. I can't be your pastor unless you know how to forgive. Because I have and I will let you down. That's who we are. We are people who need to know how to forgive if we are going to live with one another. Sometimes we're called to forgive small slights, and it's effortless, really. It's okay. It really didn't matter. But sometimes the wounds are huge. And I know that sometimes we can feel like this thing that happened, this is something I cannot forgive. This is something that I can't let go of. So I want you to remember that forgiveness isn't saying that the thing that was done was okay. Forgiveness is letting go of a debt that someone could never repay you anyway. The larger the wound, the greater the debt, and the less chance that someone could repay it. That is what forgiveness is. So when you find yourself saying to Jesus, and I have been in this place, and probably many of you have too, this thing that has happened, that someone has done to me, this is just really too great to forgive. When you find yourself in that place, I want you to picture this scene with Jesus hanging on the cross. And I want you to hear him say, "Really? Tell me about this thing that was too big to forgive." Because I know about forgiveness. Every once in a while, something comes across Facebook that is actually useful, that is worth paying attention to. And a while ago, this sign came across my page. Can you put the slide up, Bill? Can you read this with me, if you can see it? The first to apologize is the bravest. The first to forgive is the strongest. And the first to forget is the happiest. There is some truth in that little sign, isn't there? It takes a lot of courage to apologize, especially when we have seriously been in the wrong. It takes a lot of strength to forgive. And it is only when we forget, when we let it go, that we can find happiness again. This week, Lee and I saw the movie I Can Only Imagine, and I've heard several of you talking about it as well. If you haven't seen this movie yet, I encourage you to go. It is a movie that is actually worth the time that you spend there and the money that you spend to watch it. And I don't want to ruin it for you, so I won't go into any detail. But I can tell you what at least the trailer says about it. The movie tells the true story of Bart Millard, lead singer for the Christian group Mercy Me. And it tells what led this man to write what is arguably one of the greatest praise songs ever written. The trailer for the movie shows Bart saying that his father was a monster. He was abusive, all the while Bart was growing up. And he says that this monster experienced the forgiveness of Jesus Christ in his life. And it turned him from a monster into a man that Bart wanted to be. If Bart hadn't found it in himself when he went back and experienced his dad as a changed man, if he hadn't found it in himself to forgive what had happened throughout his childhood, we wouldn't have this song. Forgiveness is not only powerful, it is also beautiful. And it opens the floodgates for a lot of beautiful things. If you have someone in your past that you have a hard time forgiving, you can choose to be controlled by the bitterness and the anger and the resentment of hanging on to that wound. But you can also choose to forgive. It doesn't mean we place ourselves in the position of being doormats to be abused over and over again. It means we let go of the anger and the resentment and the bitterness. And if it feels beyond you to do that, then you can ask Jesus to help you forgive, to let go of that debt and experience freedom again. So as we move on in this account, we are told that there were two criminals who were also crucified with Jesus. And Luke again here uses a different word than the other Gospels do when he names these criminals. Matthew, Mark, and John use a word that roughly translates bandits, which is why we often refer to them as the two thieves on the cross. But Luke uses a different term that characterizes these two criminals as truly vile offenders. These are people who have done horrible, rotten things to other people. So as the crowd is milling around Jesus and the leaders and the soldiers are mocking him and scorning him, one of these criminals decides to join in with the jeering. This person who is dying himself alongside Jesus decides that he might as well taunt him too. Now, why would he do that? Why do any of us taunt other people? Because it makes us feel a little bit better by making them feel lower than us. That's why we do it. I'm sure that's why this criminal did it. The other criminal says to him, roughly translated, my own translation, "Are you crazy? We are dying here, And we deserve to die for what we've done. This man is innocent. You would mock God with your dying breath? And then he looks at Jesus and he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Now think about this for a moment. Of all the people who are gathered there at the cross with Jesus, the only one that stands up for Jesus is the vile offender on his right. The only one who says, this man is innocent. This man has done nothing wrong. This thief doesn't really know very much about Jesus. He has probably heard Jesus' prayer that he prayed as he was hung up there. Maybe he saw the sign on the cross, King of the Jews. He didn't know the Apostles' Creed because it hadn't been written yet. He didn't understand the nature of the Trinity or hold a certain view of the Scriptures. All he knew was that he was dying, and this man maybe held out some hope. That's all he knew. And you know what? That's all it took. Even as Jesus is dying, he has compassion and mercy on this person who has done terrible things in his life. And Jesus says, I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus offers this dying man hope. Death will not be the end of his life. There is more to come. Now, there's two words in that sentence that Jesus says that I think is really important for us to pay attention to. And I know that there's oftentimes been a lot of confusion within the Christian church about what happens when we die. And a lot of that comes from the letters of Paul. And Paul seems to be a little bit conflicted on that as well. You know, sometimes it seems like we're all going to just rest and rest until that final day when everyone stands up. And then in other places, Paul says, well, it's better for you if I live because I can be here to help you, but it's better for me if I die because then I'm in the presence of Christ. And people get really confused, like what happens? When does all this happen? And I think we have to remember that Paul didn't know that we were still going to be talking about this 2,000 years from when he wrote those words. Paul thought Jesus was coming back any day. So there is some confusion there. But I think it's important to pay attention to what Jesus says about the matter. And Jesus says, today, you will be with me. That's, I think, what we can count on when we die. Today, we will be with Jesus. And then he uses the term paradise. Now, in ancient times, paradise was the word used to mean the king's personal gardens. These were absolutely beautiful places filled with exotic plants and animals that were brought to the king's gardens from different places around the world. And these were just stunning places to be, but only the king and the king's favored friends were allowed to enter these gardens. No one else. People knew about them, even though they also knew they would never be allowed in. The concept was important enough that when the scriptures were translated into Greek, the Garden of Eden in Genesis was translated as paradise. People knew what paradise meant. Paradise is a place of beauty beyond our ability to imagine. So if you can think about the most beautiful place you have ever been in your life, perhaps it was the Grand Canyon at sunset or sunrise. Perhaps it was someplace in Hawaii, the flowers or the beaches of Hawaii. Maybe it was the majesty of Alaska. Or maybe it was just simply a whole field of sunflowers with their heads all turned the same direction toward the sun. Whatever you imagine as beauty. And if you can remember a certain moment of joy that you experienced that you just wished would go on forever, because it just didn't seem like it could get any better than that, and you roll all of that into one, it would be a dim reflection of the paradise that God has in store for all who put their faith and trust in him. Jesus says it isn't just reserved for a special few. It has been opened for all of us. Jesus turns to this nobody, this worse than nobody, this really bad person, And even as he is dying, even as the crowd taunts him, Jesus doesn't save himself. He saves this person and invites him into paradise. And not only him, this promise is for everyone. All we have to do is cry out, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus looks out across all of humanity and down through the ages, and he says, I save you, and 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 on and on and on. Finally, we come to the last word from the cross, uttered shortly before his death. And I think here, Jesus teaches us not only how to live, but also how to die. I want you to picture Jesus hanging there, close to death, his mother standing nearby. Now, William Barclay tells us that Jewish mothers all taught their children a prayer to pray every night at bedtime. Most of us learned a prayer to pray at bedtime, didn't we? And most of us learned, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Jewish mothers taught their children to pray verse 5 from Psalm 31. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. As Mary stood at the foot of that cross, her heart breaking, watching her son die, she heard Jesus pray the prayer that she had taught him to pray as a baby. This is a prayer I think we should all memorize. This is a prayer that can banish fear. There is no safer place for us to be than in God's hands. When we place ourselves in the hands of someone who loves us more than we could ever imagine, then we don't have to be afraid anymore, no matter what it is. We should have this prayer readily available when we are with someone who is approaching death, when we are approaching our own death. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Would you repeat that with me? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. You keep this prayer close. I encourage you, when you are worried or you are anxious or you are scared, you pray this prayer. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When you lay yourself down at night to rest, you say this prayer. When you get up in the morning, you can pray this prayer and then go out to face the day. And when you come to the end of your life, you can pray this prayer and rest, knowing that you are in the very safest place of all. Jesus taught us how to live by remembering that we're not all that, by pointing to us to notice the people that often go unnoticed, to have compassion, to extend mercy, to offer forgiveness, but also to know that we live and we die in the very safest place, in the Father's hands. Let us pray. And as I say these first words, I just invite you just to say them to yourself as well. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for promising me paradise. Everything I am and everything I have, I entrust to you. Holy, loving God, help us to practice what you have shown us. Help us to lift up the nobodies and recognize that they are somebodies. Help us to be people of mercy and compassion and forgiveness and faith. Help us to walk through these coming days with a spirit of humility and gratitude, remembering that you have done for us what we could never do for ourselves. As Jesus taught us, so we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power,